Let's now use the power of event bubbling to implement something called event delegation. So what we're going to do is to implement a smooth scrolling behavior in the navigation, so that when we click one of these links here, it will then automatically scroll smoothly to the corresponding section. All right. So right now, as we click one of these links, it actually moves there, but of course we want this to happen smoothly. And so let's now go ahead and use event delegation to implement this navigation. And actually, let's do that here at the top of the file. So here in the beginning, I will have all the code that is actually really related to the page, while down here we then have the code that we have been using to experiment with some stuff. All right. So page navigation comes right here after the model window. Let's grab this separator code here. And in fact, we can also put this code here, which was for scrolling. So this code, we also need it active in order to make this button here work, right? So let's put that actually here second. And okay. This here. All right. And these selections, I will put all of them here at the top. All right. So that's a little bit of a nicer organization, having, just like in the last project, all of the selection in one nice line. All right. Now we get this error here that button scroll to has already been declared. Oh, and that's because we actually wanted to cut this code. So we no longer want it here. Okay, so with this, we cleaned it up a little bit. And so let's now go actually to the place in code where we want to implement the page navigation. Now let's actually first implement this without using event delegation so that you can see the problem in the approach that we've been using so far. And so let's now select all of these 3 links here. So document.query selector, and actually it's got to be query selector all. And then, as we already saw in the previous video, they are called nav __ a link. Okay, so this will return a node list, and now we can use the for each method in order to attach an event handler to each of the elements that are in the node list. So actually just as we did up here, right? Okay, so for each, and so or callback function here, which gets access to the current element in the node list. And so to each element, let's now use the add event listener method. So a click, and then another callback function. So now we have callback inside of callback, but that's not a problem at all. All right, so here we again want access to the event. And now let's just start by logging to console link just like this. So indeed we get link here and on this one and also on this one. So 3 times link. Now you already start to see the problem, which is that by default, clicking one of these links will scroll to the position in the HTML. And that's because of these so-called anchors. Let me show it to you in the HTML. And so these here are called anchors. So hash and then some name here will automatically move the page to the element which has the ID of this. So let's see, down here we have, here we have this section with the ID section 2. And so as we click here then, it will automatically move to exactly that section. And we can see it here also in the URL bar, right? So we basically need to prevent that from happening. Let me just put this back here because in the last lecture we deleted this section 1 that was here. And so, as I was saying, we need to prevent this default behavior. And so for that, we use once more event, or E in this case, dot prevent default. And so let's see now. And indeed, now nothing happens. So we no longer scroll to the page, and you see that the URL bar is actually also no longer changing as we click here. So that problem is fixed. And so now let's implement the smooth navigation, or the smooth scrolling actually. Because if we didn't want the scrolling to be smooth, then we actually wouldn't need any of this, because we already saw that the browser will actually automatically move to that place, so to that anchor that we defined in HTML. Now, that anchor, however, so basically this part here is still going to be very useful, because we can now take this href attribute. So basically we can take this value here and select the element that we want to scroll to based on this. Because if we think about this, this actually looks pretty much like a selector for an ID, right? So let me write the code here, and then I will explain a little bit more. So let's get that href actually, and I'm going to call it ID. So that is at this, which is the current element, remember, dot get attribute, and then the href. Okay, and I used the get attribute function here because, as we learned before, I actually only want that part that we literally write here. So I don't want the absolute URL, and so that's why I cannot write simply this dot href. Remember that? Anyway, let's now log this to the console to see again what we're doing here. And so you see we get now section 1 here, 2, and 3. And now, as I was saying before, this here looks pretty much like a selector already. And so we can now take this and select an element based on this, and then simply scroll to that element. So for that, we're going to use the scroll into view method here again. So let me show that to you. So document.query selector, and now all I need to pass in is this ID, right? Because again, this exact string that we get from the href attribute is already the perfect selector, so we can just use that. Okay? And so this is a pretty common technique that we use for implementing a navigation like this. So we put the ID of the element that we want to scroll to here in the href attribute, so that then in the JavaScript we can read that. So we can read that href, and then we can select the element that we want to scroll to. So in this case, it's the element with the ID section 1. And that is exactly this one here. So exactly the first section. All right. So here we have the element now selected, and now all we need is to call scroll into view, and then with behavior set to smooth, just like we did already here before. Okay, and that's actually already it. So that worked beautifully, right? All right, and now the third one, and here we go. Well, that didn't really scroll to where I thought it should go. But now it did. Apparently, something weird happened there, but that's not a problem. Now, as you see, this actually works just fine, but the problem is that it's not really efficient. So we are adding here the exact same callback function. So this event handler here, we are adding it once to each of these 3 elements. So the exact same function is now attached to these three elements. And that's kind of unnecessary. I mean, of course, it would be fine for only 3 elements, but what if we had 1000 or like 10,000 elements? If we would attach an event handler to 10,000 elements like this, so like we did here with the for each function, then we would effectively be creating 10,000 copies of this same function here. And so that would then certainly impact the performance. And it's really just not a clean solution in that case. And so the better solution, without a doubt, is to use event delegation. So in event delegation, we use the fact that events bubble up. And we do that by putting the event listener on a common parent of all the elements that we are interested in. And so in our example, it's this container that's around all of these links that we saw in the previous video. So remember, that is this element here. So we will put our event handler on this element here, and then when a user clicks one of the links, the event is generated and bubbles up just as we saw in the last video. And then we can basically catch that event in this common parent element and handle it there, because we also know where the event actually originated, right? So we can figure that out by looking at the event.target property. So that's what event delegation is. And so let's now go ahead and implement it. All right. So in event delegation, we basically need 2 steps. First, we add the event listener to a common parent element of all the elements that we're interested in. So let me actually write that here, because this is a really important technique. So as I said, add event listener to common parent element. And then in that event listener, determine what element originated the event, so that we can then work with that element where the event was actually created. So let's do that. Document.query selector. And so remember, the common element of all these links is nav links. So again, it's this. Yeah, it's this element. And so this is where we add the event listener. And now we just need to figure out where the event actually happened. And remember that that is stored in event.target, right? So event.target becomes really, really useful now in this strategy, because we can now use this information exactly to basically see where that event happened. So as I click here, we can now see well, that the event occurred from this element. And as we click here, then we see that it originated, of course, from this one. Okay? And as we click somewhere here in the middle, then we see that the click, of course, happened in this entire element, not in one of the links. And this part is actually important to notice, because now we actually only want to work with the clicks that happened on one of the links. So only this one or this one, but the click that happens here on this nav links element is not relevant at all. And so now we need a matching strategy here in order to match only the elements that we are actually interested in. All right. And in this case, the best way to do that is to simply check if the target has this navlink class. All right. So this is the matching strategy. And this can sometimes be one of the hardest things to come up when you use this technique. But many times I actually do it like this. So I check if the target element contains the class that we are interested in. So class list, and then remember we can use the contains method. And then we can simply check if it contains the class nav link. And so that's then this one here, right? And only if it does, then let's log link. So let's see. So as we click, we get link, you see? Or another one, and we also get link. But then as we click somewhere else, like here in the middle, then we do not get link. All right? And so now we successfully basically only selected the link elements itself. And so now we can basically do exactly what we did here before. So we actually also need to prevent the default. And so let's get all of this. And replace that here. Get rid of the comments. And this one here, so preventing the default, we actually always want that, or to do that. So no matter where we are clicking, nothing should happen. All right. So let's try that. Oh, and here we get this error, and we get null on line 87. So that's this. Oh, and of course, we still have a problem here, because the href attribute is now not on this, but it is on the element that was clicked. And so that is again e.target. So that's the whole reason why we're using e.target in the first place. So let's try now. And beautiful. Now it actually works. So you see, we still get the same sections here also logged to the console, and it scrolls to exactly where we want it to go. Awesome. So this works beautifully, and yeah, we successfully implemented event delegation, which is a lot better and a lot more efficient than simply attaching the same event handler to multiple elements. Instead, we simply added one big event handler function to the parent element of all the elements that we're interested in, and then we simply determined where the click event came from. And then we also needed this matching strategy because we wanted to basically ignore clicks that did not happen right on one of these links. And coming up with this matching strategy, as I like to call it, is probably the hardest part of implementing event delegation. But don't worry, because there will be plenty of examples throughout the rest of the course. And so at some point, it will all make a lot of sense to you. So I hope that you're convinced that event delegation is a much better strategy, even though it requires a little bit more work than the first implementation that we did. And in fact, there is actually an even more important use case of event delegation, which is when we are working with elements that are not yet on the page on runtime, so by the time the page loads. And a great example are buttons that are added dynamically while using the application. So it's not possible to add event handlers onto elements that do not exist. But we will still be able to handle events on elements that don't exist at the beginning by using event delegation one more time. And we will actually do this later in this section.